Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 111, we sit down with Karen Bloom Gevirtz, author of The Apothecary's Wife, to explore the forgotten legacy of women in medicine, drawing from her deep expertise in 17th and 18th century British literature and history. Gevirtz reveals how healing was once the domain of women, grounded in community knowledge and care, before being overtaken by professional and profit-driven medicine. We explore how early apothecaries and physicians used economic forces, public messaging, and rising capitalist structures to discredit female healers and turn medicine into a commodity. From the commercialization of care in the 1600s to modern Big Pharma, Gevirtz helps us trace a direct line between history and today's healthcare system. This conversation is a deep dive into the crossroads of gender, medicine, and capitalism, and how history can help us imagine a better way forward. So I hope you enjoy episode 111 with Karen Bloom Gevirtz. This episode was recorded March 11th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. And so could you give us a little background about yourself, your academic background?
Sure. So I am a native New Yorker and born and bred. And my background is primarily really in literature of the 17th and 18th century. I have undergraduate degree in English, and I have a PhD in 17th and 18th century British literature, but I have always been really interested in science at the same time. So I'm sort of a weird duck, right? I'm not a STEM person, but I'm also not, I don't have both feet in the humanities at the same time. So, for example, in college, I was an English major, but I was also pre-med and I worked in a neurochemistry lab, researching. In those days, it was a very long time ago, and we were researching the neurochemical mechanism for depression. If we can imagine a time when we didn't know how it worked. So I've always been really interested in the intersection of science and language and text. How does text help us understand science's ideas? How did science affect the way we talk? What things have entered into our common speech now that we don't even think about that were originally scientific ideas? And in particular, I got into working in what I would call the language of early science, but is sort of more generally considered, I think, history of science. Because I was really interested in the fact that the English novel and the scientific revolution took place at the same time. And there's just no coincidences. So I thought, well, how could that have happened? So that was a book that I published in 2014, Women, the Novel, and Natural History, Natural Philosophy. Sorry, well, my own title. And I just kept working from there. So I really love this place where you need to know some science. You have to understand how math contributes to understanding the universe without actually having to do the math. And at the same time, I really love being able to work in the innovative texts of the period that I really love so much.
Yes. No, that's definitely an interesting time period within history and British literature.
And here too, I
And
mean,
yes.
the United States was invented during the 18th century. So when my students, I used to teach them when my students said, well, it's such a boring period, I would go, well, I don't know, like the newspaper was invented, the United States was invented, and they're like, wait, what?
Mhm.
So
Yes.
yeah, it's a really exciting time, actually. It gets a bad rap, but it's a very exciting time.
Yes. And now, so to get to your book, you recently, The Apothecary's Wife, recently came out. And could you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. Yes. This is actually sort of a great story and also a slightly embarrassing one at the same time. But since I don't make a secret of it in the book itself, no skeletons in the closet. So I was in August of 2017 researching how early science made its way into ordinary women's lives. So how did it become part of what people just thought of every day? There were a lot of things that I was looking at. There were public lectures in coffee houses and all sorts of publications. I went to England on a fellowship to a really beautiful place called Chawton House Library. And I was researching how early science made its way into women's recipe books because women's recipe books contained recipes for cooking, how to roast a collar of lamb, how to pickle chestnuts, how to candy violets, but also medications, how to make worm medicine, how to make eye medicine, how to treat jaundice, all that sort of thing. And I got to Chawton House Library, and the first day I was down in the basement where they keep the books in this beautiful temperature controlled 500-year-old basement. And the archivist said, well, of course, you want to see Blackwell's Herbal. And I said, well, sure, of course, yes. But I had no idea what it was, none. And, but, you had to be polite. And when an archivist tells you to go look at something, you should definitely go look at it. So he said, well, there it is. And I looked at it, and almost instantly I knew that my thesis for the project that I had spent almost 2 years working on was completely wrong. Science had not sort of quietly oozed its way into ordinary life. It hadn't been absorbed into regular women's lives like a sponge takes up water. On the contrary, what I discovered was that it was really contentious when it came to recipes. That there was, in fact, competition with women by the professionals who practiced early scientific medicine. And I thought, that's crazy. Who could possibly consider an ordinary housewife competition by the middle of the 17th century, 18th century, sorry. That's bananas. And so after I recovered from my shock of having spent 2 years researching something that was wrong, which is never a good feeling, I said, "Well, wait a minute. This is crazy, fascinating," and that's how I got started. I spent the rest of the month that I was at Chawton beginning to work on it and trying out my ideas on the other fellows, and I got more and more and more excited, and that's how this book was born. And what I discovered was there was a change from the over the course of the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th centuries that medication had been a household good. It had been something that you got at home, the way you got your collar of beef and your pickled chestnuts at home. And suddenly we were paying for it. How did that happen? And the usual
Mm,
story is because medicine became better. So of course people started paying for it. And what I discovered on that very first day, looking in Blackwell's Herbal, was the medicine was exactly the same. So if the medicine was exactly the same, why do people start paying for it?
mm,
Why pay for something that you can get for free? Why get it from a total stranger outside the home when you can get it from someone you know and trust inside the home? I
yes.
thought, wow, how did they pull that off if the medication was exactly the same and everybody knew it? How did they pull that off? And that's what
Mm.
this book is about.
But before that changeover in the commodity of medicine,
Mhm.
for centuries, was it predominantly women that were
Yeah.
doing these practices?
Yeah, it was. So, I'm talking about medicine strictly in the West, right? The Greeks and
Hmm.
Romans on up. So I'm not talking about China or India or Africa, which in some ways were actually way ahead of Western Europe in terms of, so for example, there was inoculation against smallpox in China, in India, in Africa, centuries before we had inoculation against smallpox in the West. And in fact, the West got it from the East and from Africa. Um, so so I'm really just keeping my history to the West.
Hmm.
Yes, there was historically for more than 1,000 years, well over 1,000 years, um, there was a professional class of physicians who were trained through education and lectures and reading and so on. And then the vast majority of healthcare was provided at home. Physicians charged money. Most people didn't have spare change lying around for medical treatment. Physicians did not have a very good reputation.
Hmm.
They tended to use remedies in conjunction with some pretty violent things to the body, like bleeding. And because they were university trained, they didn't change the way they did things when it didn't work. So they figured if a patient died, it wasn't the problem wasn't the treatment, the problem was the patient, right? They hadn't given enough of the medication or not for long enough or something like that, as opposed to maybe you just shouldn't give them, hemlock, right? Like
Hmm.
not really a good thing to treat headache unless you're seeking
Hmm.
a permanent solution, so to speak. So, so for thousands of years, if you wanted help, if you had an infection or a fever, or you were prone to miscarriage, or you had a trembling in your hands, you had a eye infection that wouldn't go away, you went to mom or whoever the woman in charge was. And mom got her recipes from her mom, but she also got it from the other women in her community. So women shared their information freely. The idea was if you've got a good cure, you don't keep it to yourself, you give it to everybody else, right? So it's
Hmm.
not that women went around going, you should take my, you should use my cure for jaundice. It was that if you didn't have one that worked very well, you said, well, you know who does? Mrs. Smith, down the road. She's got a really good
Hmm.
one. Let me go ask her for hers. And Mrs. Smith would give it to you. Of course, she didn't own it. She just knew it, which is different. So Mrs. Smith would share her recipe and you would share your recipe, and women's recipe knowledge, because it was oral long before it was written, women's recipe knowledge was all about anything that was good for the family. So you want to know a good way of cooking peas? That would go, into your recipe store. If you
Hmm.
want to know a good salve for gunpowder burns, that would go into your recipe store. So that was how the vast majority of people got medical treatment in
Huh.
Europe.
Uh,
There were not very many doctors. They cost money. They tended to hang out with the very affluent who could pay the money. And where else would you get treatment? So when Catholicism was dominant, you could also get treatment at your local convent or monastery. They usually had an herbalist slash infirmarian person, depending on the size of the institution. But when Protestantism came along, a lot of places stopped having convents and monasteries. So then you
hmm.
really had to depend on mom.
Hmm.
And if you didn't live near a convent or monastery anyway, you were still out of luck anyhow. So that's who treated you for a
Huh.
long, long time. And if it didn't work, she wouldn't use it again. So if Mrs. Smith used her worm medicine on little Betty and Betty's worms didn't go away, Mrs. Smith stopped using it and she didn't give it to anybody else. She was like, yeah, that doesn't work. Got to try something else, which is very different from the academically trained physicians, um,
Hmm.
who, as I said, if the book said that it should be this way, then they believed that it should be that way, and they
Hmm.
stuck to it no matter what. Um, And then once the scientific revolution came along, then people started thinking, intellectuals started thinking, the way we've been identifying something as true, as knowledge, is really problematic. Just because a guy who lived 1,000 years ago, like Galen or Hippocrates, said that it's so, doesn't make it so. And so once the scientific revolution started challenging the idea that because somebody tells you it must be true, then the possibility opened up for changing how medicine was made, how it was prescribed. And that
mm,
was the opening that the professionals were looking for, to
mm,
get more people to come to them and fewer people to go to mom. There are a lot
mm,
of other factors, the question of war, the greater spreading of wealth, the rise of the merchant class, blah blah blah. But in terms of just the idea that it was normal to pay for medicine, um, that that was made possible by the scientific revolution, and that's when things started to change. But
yes.
yeah, for thousands of
But
years, that boo boo, that was for mom.
and I was curious, were you able to find out some of the most, even some of the most effective remedies that were developed? How did some of those even impact modern medicine today?
So there's sort of two ways of answering that question. One is huge impact today,
Mhm,
and the second is um, some of those medicines worked well enough that they continued to be used for a long time, but
mm,
were not better than what we have now, thanks to modern science. So there were things that you could eat, for example, that they knew um, helped out fever, right? So there
mhm,
was a plant called feverfew, and the name says it all, right? So you could, I think it was a tea that they usually made from feverfew. Also, wormwood helped with fever, and a lot of people use that. But if you lived in a place where you couldn't get those things, right? That you lived in an environment where they didn't grow, they weren't native to the area, or it was not a hospitable climate or the wrong soil or something like that, you didn't have it. You probably didn't even know about it.
mhm,
So you might have something else. So one of the things that's really interesting is that um, even in England, which is pretty small, right? Like you can
mhm,
drive across it in less time than it takes to drive to Chicago from New York.
mhm,
Um, so you can, I mean, the long end, I don't mean the short end, because that takes about as long as New York to Boston. Um,
mhm,
so you still had a huge range of environments and species variety, diversity. So you might get preferred treatments in one set of recipe books from one area that you wouldn't see in recipe books from another area because those plants didn't grow or they were much harder to get hold of or something else had sort of become traditional, something like that. So were there curative properties to some of the organic substances that people use to treat things? Yeah, absolutely. Not everything. They used something called water gentian, I think it's called, to treat diseases, and it turns out that it's incredibly toxic to your liver. And it was considered sort of standard treatment for all sorts of things. And the answer is, yeah, you really shouldn't be taking that. That's super, super bad for you. But there were other things that do have some curative properties. It turns out that wormwood, for example, has chemical substances in it that really do make pain go away and stuff like that. Wormwood is the foundation of what we know as salicylic acid or aspirin. So those substances were in those plants. And one of the things that chemistry, once it became a science over the course of the 17th and the 18th century, chemistry figured out how to extract and identify the curative substance from whatever those things were, and figured out how to synthesize it on its own. So the aspirin that you get in aspirin is not actually exactly the same molecule that you get from wormwood, for example. It's been manipulated in a lab to be more effective. But did wormwood work? Yeah, actually, wormwood worked. So kind of cool. Chamomile really
Yes.
does help with headaches. I mean, does it help with headaches as well as, say, acetaminophen? No, not really. But so would I mean, I wouldn't advocate anything. I'm not a physician, or I don't have any medical treatment training at all. But I definitely wouldn't advocate, treating your migraine with 12,000 gallons of chamomile tea. Like, just not, I wouldn't go there, personally. So, so yes. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about modern medication, modern pharmaceuticals, is that a lot of them began life, not just aspirin, but a lot of them began life as an organic substance, probably herbaceous, a root, bark, a leaf, a bud,
Mm,
something like that. And either we still get it from, um, we still get the foundational substance from a plant, or we have learned how to synthesize it from the plants, as I was saying. So for a long time, for example, two cancer-fighting drugs, vinblastine and vincristine, um, their foundational molecules were too complex to be
mm,
synthesized in a lab with any kind of efficiency. They were way too complicated. They took way too long. And so you had to start with the plant, and
mhm,
then work until you could get to the molecule that you were looking for to treat cancer. And they're incredibly effective, like spectacularly effective. So so we have things like that. We also have something that when it's exploitative, we call bioprospecting, and when it's um, collaborative, um, we call ethnomedicine. And that is scientists going to um, indigenous communities or local communities, finding out what their traditional cures are, and testing them in labs, finding whether there really is a curative property to the plant or the combination, and then creating medications from them if there really is.
mhm,
Um, so vinblastine and vincristine, for example, started life in that way. Somebody found out about traditional treatment, they went and they figured out what it is, and then they started making cancer drugs. Now that's bioprospecting because the communities that they got it from have never benefited from the billions of dollars that those cancer drugs generate. But
mm,
other medications have been found through collaboration with indigenous communities, and those communities do get the credit and they do get a share of the profits or other kinds of benefits from that collaboration. So it's not reliably so, but it is becoming much more of a shared endeavor than
mm.
it used to be.
Okay. And also, you mentioned the commercialization of medicine. Some of that was in regards to the scientific revolution, but was this between more with medicine becoming a commodity? Was that between 1650 and 1740,
Yeah.
that time frame? And maybe what were some of the other key events to force this transformation?
Well, so 1650 to 1740 is not a random set of dates, and at all. What's very interesting about 1650 is that's when the English Civil War ends, and economic stability, cultural stability relative to a civil war, social stability, religious stability, come to England. And England is on the brink of being a huge global power, right, in 1650.
Mm,
So, I mean, Jamestown has been a horrible disaster, but they're less than 20 years away from getting New York, for example. So 1650 is really sort of this marvelous turning point in British history. And Britain is important because um, it is a Protestant country. There are no convents and monasteries there. They've all been wiped out. Catholicism is illegal. And
mm,
so the only mechanisms you have for getting healthcare is mom or the professionals. And so that's a place where the competition was pretty direct. There wasn't a way to sort of redirect any of that need to, say, the local convent. So 1650 is a really, that's a big date. And what happens in 1653 really is the first recipe book attributed to a woman appears in print. It's the Countess of Kent's recipe book. It's called A Choice Manual. And she was dead, but the guy who printed it made a ton of money from it. And what's fascinating about this is that recipe books were women's property. They were considered family goods. You inherited them. You didn't sell them. You didn't mass produce them, and they were personal. So by printing and selling the Countess of Kent's recipe book, the idea was introduced that you could privatize this knowledge. You could turn it into something that you could buy and sell. And that was really the first moment where we see, when it comes to medication, this shift, right? That's the first push to commodify, to turn medicine something that you buy and sell. So 1650, the end of the Civil War, is really big, and then the publication of the Countess of Kent's recipe book, A Choice Manual, very soon after that, is really like, those are kind of the watershed moments where, the starting gun goes off, so to speak.
Yes.
So I say 1740 because by then the transition has reached the point of no return. So even though women continued to keep recipe books for another 60, 80 years, the real medical authority was either your local apothecary, who made medicines and sold their own over-the-counter meds, or your local physician. And you were accustomed to paying that person. So, for example, when Jane Austen was dying at the end of her life, she lived in a little village. She lived in Chawton, down the road from Chawton House Library. As it happened, you could walk from one to the other. And she was really sick, so they took her to Winchester because there was a very famous apothecary there who worked with a physician, and the apothecary was highly respected. And people thought, well, he could help her, right? He could, and no, the answer was no. She was dying and she died. But the idea was, here in this big city, there was somebody, a professional, who really knew medication. That's 1818. So that's sort of the kind of transition we're talking about. So the tipping point really came by 1740, and for me, the landmark event that shows that tipping point has happened, has been reached, is a woman named Joanna Stevens, who had a gout medication. And when she was doing very, very well, the physicians were economically jealous, so to speak, and presumably the apothecaries too. And they basically hunted her down and forced her to reveal the recipe for her medication. And that ruined her economically, of course. But the physicians and the apothecaries were able to make a ton of money from it. And that was accepted. That was all right. And that's sort of the moment when you can see there's that the economic engine driving the professionals has become so powerful at that point, and it's become so normal that Joanna Stevens can be sort of, not literally, but figuratively, bludgeoned into giving her recipe.
Yes.
So that's really the tipping point for me.
And was there a point where, how did some of these early professional apothecaries and physicians convince the public that their treatments were superior to those of women at the time?
So this is where I should say you should read my book, because every chapter has another strategy. But what I will say is, I will summarize. my extremely brilliant and very witty, well-researched book, and say that there were a bunch of different ways that they did it. One, right, was they reconceptualized recipes as private, right, as private
Mm,
property. And that's where the Countess of Kent's recipe book is sort of this landmark event, a watershed moment. Um, and and at that point, it no longer becomes communal. It no longer becomes home-based. Then people begin to think,
mm,
oh, this is something that has to do actually with commerce and trade. And I don't
mm,
mean the herbs and the substances, coral or pearl, those things were used medicinally, or spices or things like that. I don't mean those. Those were all those. If you couldn't grow them, you had to buy them, right? But I mean the knowledge itself was something that you had to pay for. So one way they did it was by using what we call print culture to make it normal, that you bought this stuff, that somebody owned it and
mm,
they could charge you for it. Another thing that they did was they separated food from medicine. They drew the line very clearly between them. And up to that moment, there really wasn't as strong a distinction as we have now. The idea that foods could be used medicinally, or that medications belonged in the kitchen, right? Those things, there was there's much more sort of interplay. It was more like a continuum than it was a binary opposition, so to speak. And so one of the things the professionals did was they drew a really clear line between them, and they said, listen, food, you gals can have that. We can see that again through print culture. Um, Cookbooks, housekeeping manuals, things like that for women had less and less and less space devoted to medical care, and more and more and more space devoted to culinary recipes, how to take care of your linen, how to clean your
mm,
floor, how to scour pots, that sort of thing. So that was another way um, that the professionals were able to do that. They really pried those two things apart. Um, there were other strategies as well. They introduced the idea of regulation, the idea that an expert should analyze the medication, do some studies, gather some data. How well did it work? How safe was it for the people who used it? And then approve or disapprove. And there are a lot of really great things about regulation. I mean, it was introduced in part to control the marketplace, and in part because there were all these quacks wandering around selling crazy things that were killing people, and everybody was sort of taking
mm,
it and not knowing any better. And a really good example of that sort of thing today, right, is the people hawking colloidal silver. There's
mm,
nothing remotely healing about colloidal silver. I mean, you might as well melt down your jewelry and drink it. It's just there's nothing good about it. And in fact, that is a treatment that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Um, it's not really great for you. Arsenic's not good for you, antimony's not good for you, sulfur's not good for you, mercury's not good for you. And these were all things that the quacks were using in really crazy doses.
mhm,
They introduced regulation, but regulation could also be used to delegitimize women's medication. So women who were selling their meds or women who were using similar ingredients, the physicians and the apothecaries could say that's really not okay. Like that stuff is bad
mm,
for you. So those are
yes.
some of the ways um, that they were able to do that. Now, I'm making it sound like it was the men against the women and the professionals against the housewives, and that's an easy simplification. That's not exactly how it worked. I should just put in a quick note that real life is complicated, and this is
Mhm.
complicated too. So you had men and women on both sides. Um,
Yeah, okay.
so domestic medicine was practiced almost uniformly by women. There were, if there wasn't a woman around, then it was dad who fixed the boo-boo. If mom was dead and you were living far away from your neighbors, well, was dead, right?
Hmm.
But you also had women without scientific training who thought that the new science that came in and the new medicine that came with it was better than what they had to offer, and they
Hmm.
bought into it 110%. You also had men who were saying, this domestic medicine is much better. It's been working for centuries, and you doctors are crazy people. And no, I'm not going to do that. And I'm still going to my wife, who's way better than you. So it wasn't as neat and tidy. There were also plenty of women in the early days who were interested in early science. And we have women who've been written out of the historical record. Some of them are in my book, like Catherine Jones, Lady Ranelagh, who was one of the pioneers of chemistry. She's been written out of textbooks, she's been written out of sort of common knowledge, but she was incredibly important to the development of chemistry as we know it, as it became a science rather than alchemy. So we've lost a lot of the women. So we think of it as all men versus all women. It was really ideas versus ideas where the majority of people who were commodifying medication and believed that it should be commodified and were benefiting from its commodification, right? Benefiting from turning it into something you bought outside the home, were men. And the majority of people who were offering it, the vast majority of people who were offering it at home for free, were women. So
Hmm.
you can simplify it sort of on the basis of percentages, but in practice, there were people who believed in both or one or the other who did not match sort of the gender profile, so to speak.
Oh, that's interesting.
So
On
Lady
that one.
Catherine, Lady Ranelagh, for example, was a pioneer in chemistry, but she also was a very respected practitioner of domestic medicine. And she was brought into medical events in the royal family, and she was connected to all sorts of people and collected recipes from anybody. So she didn't distinguish. For her, did it work? Great, let's use it. So she's a really good example of a woman who did not see a problem with using either one, and did
Hmm.
not accept the binary at all,
Yes.
and would have been really irritated. She died in, I think, 1699, and she would have been really irritated to see that women were totally pushed out of these things. Um,
Yes.
so she was a brilliant, very tough cookie. Also, I
Mm.
suppose you had to be. But
Yes. And then also just moving forward with the role of capitalism and the economic
mhm,
structures that were starting to play out in shaping and shifting this to a more for-profit
mhm.
healthcare. Is that something else you also touch on that
Yeah.
within the book?
Yes, yes. So a significant driver in turning medication into something that's bought and sold, was economic gain, right? Now,
Hmm.
people who advocated for the new science were not purely um, selfish, greedy money grubbers, right? People who advocated for the scientific revolution's ideas, methods, on the vast majority of them believed in it 100%. They absolutely thought that that was a far superior way of identifying things as true than any other way of doing it. So one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that the development of a pharmaceutical industry was not purely cynical self-interest. It was genuine belief that science really would make life better. And
Hmm.
um, and look around, right? We have clean water, but people don't die of cholera anymore just because they live near a public well, because we really don't have public wells anymore either. We have plumbing, and we we have antibiotics, and we have cancer medications, and I mean, like, science has done pretty well.
Mhm.
Some of its inventions may be better than others. I think there's some ambivalence about, say, cell phones. But on the other hand, there's plenty of good stuff that scientists come up with, right? So people who propounded the scientific revolution's ideas, one of the things about the scientific revolution was a primary principle of it was all knowledge should be used for the bettering of humanity.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
that was and if you didn't know what it was good for, you just stored it up and held on to it because it would be useful someday. So
Mm.
and that proves true more often than not. Although people are always saying, well, what good is it? I mean, if you look at, say, military aircraft wings, the study of aerodynamics has a lot to do with the study of butterflies, bees, and birds. So, for example, studying camouflage in butterflies and how when they fly, they appear to be something or they don't appear to be something, they reflect the light in certain ways, became very useful for developing stealth aircraft. Um,
Mhm.
so, it's not that the person who was studying butterflies was like, I know this will be great for the military. It was the military was like, hey, wow, that's pretty nifty stuff. So that's like exactly how science was really developed to work. I'm sorry, I hate to say this, but I've lost track of your initial question.
No, just
I get really excited and then I'm so far off track.
no, just that role of the economic structures and
Right.
capitalism coming into play.
Thank you. Yes. So science and capitalism developed simultaneously,
Mhm.
and they developed hand in hand.
Mhm.
That doesn't make science corrupt. We tend to go, oh my God, it had something to do with money and private property, and that means that it's totally unreliable and we shouldn't trust it, and scientists are out for their own personal gain and blah, blah, blah. And the answer is sometimes, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes. A really good example of that is Robert Gallo, when people were looking to identify the virus that caused AIDS. He basically stole information and materials from the scientists at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, and claimed sole credit for
Mhm.
identifying the virus. Well, why? Why would he do something so underhanded and dishonest? And that was because there's a huge amount of glory and credit and presumably money that attached to that. And it was really tough for him to hold out against those appeals. He has not gone down in history with much sheen to him, right? I mean, he was left out of even any mention by the Nobel Committee when
Mhm.
they awarded it to the French scientists. So yeah, sometimes there's some pretty awful stuff that's done by scientists, and certainly pharmaceutical companies are designed to make money. They're not designed with the primary purpose of curing ills. They're designed with the purpose of making money from curing ills, which is not the same. So, yeah, those two do go together, but capitalism is not inevitably evil and corrupt in that it can enable things to happen when used properly. Like
Yes.
automobiles run people over, that's bad. Fires kill people, that's bad. On the other hand, you
Mhm.
can cook something with fire, you have to sort of use it well. Cars can get you
Mhm.
from one place to the other actually quickly and safely, used properly. And what the capitalist circulation of wealth has enabled is mass production of things. So,
Mhm.
insulin, for example, was originally developed in universities. It was being manufactured by universities, um, but universities simply couldn't, no university lab could keep up with the demand for insulin
Mhm.
in one country alone, let alone worldwide. And so that's why they brought on corporations. Now, unfortunately, what happened was, right, insulin became the property of corporations and became a huge golden goose. And corporations make fortunes from insulin alone, right? That's bad. But the fact that corporations, which come about because of capitalism, were able to mass produce insulin and save lives, it's not an unambiguous situation. I
Hmm.
think so. We have to, people don't necessarily like living with complexity, but we really do have to live with complexity, unfortunately or
Yes.
unfortunately. So just like it's not men are evil and women are good, doctors are evil and housewives are good. It's a more complicated situation.
Hmm.
So the fact that in some countries, especially the United States, it is normal that people die because they cannot pay for medication, is to me certainly appalling, outrageous, horrific. But that is not inevitable in a capitalist system. You can look at the UK, you can look at the Netherlands, um, you can look at a lot of the economies that developed post World War II, especially in Asia, um, where there is a very robust public health mechanism. And it's not that these countries don't have capitalist economies, they do.
Hmm.
Um, but the economy has been adjusted so that healthcare occupies a very different niche, right? It,
Hmm.
it serves a very different economic purpose, because it serves a very different national purpose in
Hmm.
other places. So the United States, we have this system that I would argue is dysfunctional because it is so normal to us that people die. We are offended, and yet we continue on, right? So when Luigi Mangione shot the CEO of United Healthcare, there's a huge upwelling of support for him. I mean, if it were just two people on a street, right? One guy versus another guy, one guy has a gun and shoots him, the other one in the back of the head and runs off. That scenario is horrifying and appalling, and you would want somebody brought to justice. But because of the way American healthcare is set up, because the United Healthcare CEOs um, power was built on um, extorting money, building an economic empire, denying care, um, it seems like a very different situation. So that's not inevitable to capitalism, and we know that because there are plenty of countries with capitalist economies. Um, but but it has to be a deliberate choice of the people who live in that economic system
Hmm.
to do something to medication, to do something to healthcare that takes it out of its strictly economic function, or its
Hmm.
primarily economic function. And
Yes.
that's something the United States is either going to have to deal with, either by actually making a change or deciding not to, right? Like
Hmm.
not changing is a way of dealing with it, right? We're just going
Yes.
to keep on as we are. And instead of changing the system, healthcare CEOs will have to get armed guards and and wear armor and Kevlar. Um, we could
Yeah.
go at it that way, or we could rethink the system. Um,
Mm.
so so yes, the science, capitalism, modern medicine, all of these things develop together and hand in hand, but they are not necessarily one is not necessarily corruptive of the others. It's not
But
inevitable,
yes.
in my
But if we,
opinion, and in my historical analysis.
what happens if we rethink medicine more as a public good rather than a commodity? Is that within the book? Is that there's some lessons we could take from the past in that
Yeah,
regard?
absolutely. I mean, I think a really good example right now of that question is the language that's being used about vaccines. So domestic medicine, the system that we had before medication became something to be bought and sold, um, domestic medicine said that health and illness are community issues, right? They
Mm.
are issues for the community. if I know something that can make you better, even if you're not in my family, even if you're not me, um, of course I give it to you. Why wouldn't I? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was domestic medicine's view. Of course you shared it. Of course you lent somebody the ingredients if they didn't have it. Of course you told them a great recipe. Of course, if you went to visit a friend or family 20, 60, 80 miles off, you would write your favorite recipe in the recipe book of your host and vice versa, right? Of course. Um, so the idea that your well-being has something to do with me is built into domestic medicine. So when John Donne spoke about, other men's crosses are not my crosses, right? And he deplored that attitude. That line, other men's crosses are not my crosses, was something he thought was a horrible attitude. And that attitude was totally antithetical to domestic medicine.
Mm-hmm.
But it is exactly the kind of rhetoric that you hear now about vaccines. I
Mm-hmm.
decide for myself about a vaccine. Do I have an obligation to get a vaccine because it will benefit other people? That's not the rhetoric, right? The language that you see, and you can read, I'm not coming up with this, right? You can read any news story, you can read any statement by the Secretary of Health and Human Services that health guidance now is being framed as a question of individual choice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, I suppose, but the question is whether your health and my health matter to each other. And as somebody who lives in the world with you, I have an obligation that we belong to a community. So why should you get a measles vaccine? Well, you should get a measles vaccine because presumably you do not want to be dead or maimed by measles. Um, blindness, deafness, there's some indication of sterility, death, all of these things,
Mm-hmm.
miscarriage, all of these things are possibilities with measles. Measles are 90% contagious, which means that if one person in a room if one person in a room has it, 90% of the people in the room will get it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is really, really nasty. It is tough and long-lived and incredibly contagious and devastating, right? So why get a measles vaccine? Well, I don't want to get measles, so I would like to live a long, healthy life. And by the way, I don't want to get chickenpox either, although people tend to think of that as a relatively benign right of childhood, because it's actually a horrible virus and it stays with you and then attacks you later in life. And it can
Mm-hmm.
be devastating. It's called shingles when it comes back. And it can disfigure, it can do incredible damage. You can get shingles blisters anywhere, anywhere. You can get it on your eye, you can get blisters inside your mouth. You can get them anywhere, right? So, why get the chickenpox vaccine if you just get some spots and then you don't ever get it again? Because you do get it again. And because if you infect a woman who's pregnant with chickenpox and she hasn't been immunized, she can pass it to the baby can develop birth defects. Like there are lots of really good reasons why it's not just good for you, but it's good for somebody else. But we have to
Mm-hmm.
think of it that way. Domestic
Yeah.
medicine would say other men's crosses are my crosses. I don't want you to get measles. I don't
Mm-hmm.
want you to be blinded. I don't want you to die, whether you are 80 or 8 months or 8 weeks. I don't want it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want it if you live next door to me. I don't want it if you live across town or in the next state or in the next region or a different country or hemisphere. I don't want somebody else to get this horrible thing. But
Mm-hmm.
you have to think of health that way, that health isn't just an individual issue, it's a community issue.
Mm-hmm.
So in some countries, the phrase public health is very powerful. In the United States, public health tends to be sort of regarded as a namby-pamby kind of idea. If we framed it as national security, it would be totally different, right? If
Yes.
we considered somebody letting measles loose in the population as biowarfare, it would be a totally different thing. So domestic medicine has a lot to teach us about sort of a way of, sounds ridiculous, a way of living. How do we want to be on the planet? Do we want to be connected to other people? Do we want to recognize our obligations to them? In New
Yes.
Jersey, I pay taxes. In New York, you pay taxes. Well, your tax money goes to help somebody in Mississippi and Alabama. New York gets less money back from the federal budget than it contributes per citizen, right? It gets, I don't know, 80 cents to every dollar that it kicks in. Well, Mississippi and Alabama get anywhere from, say, $1.20, $1.60 for every dollar they put in. Why do we do things that way? Shouldn't New Yorkers just say, my dollar is my dollar? And the answer is no, because we all live together. And
Hmm.
if it's good for Alabama, it's good for New York, right? So that's a view that has to do with what political theorists would call the social contract, John Locke would call the social contract, and public health people would call public health.
Hmm. Yes. No, but it's definitely interesting seeing that. I don't know if it's somewhat of some public resistance to the modern medicine, but then also people might think of I might use other natural remedies from the past, but then just kind of analyzing the past and today and thinking of the people's what they might come up with in terms of or these is just they're trying to make money off of me or they're
Mm-hmm,
this is their way of controlling the individual. But
mm-hmm.
I think, like you said, there needs to it's almost too much individualistic uh, within society today. Maybe that for the own public good, we need to come together and obviously the resistance to some of that modern science or modern medicine is not good for society.
Certainly, from my perspective as somebody who researches the impact of science, right? The way science shapes society, language, culture, and the way culture, language, society shapes science. Um, from my perspective, where I sit, I would say history tells us that understanding that the human being who practices science may not be pure of heart, but that science itself is a practice and a way of identifying knowledge, that's a really important distinction, right? So another way of looking at it is the way people have talked about Catholicism. There is a faith. Now, some of the people who practice that faith have done super bad things. I mean,
Hmm.
we can talk about the way the church has enabled pedophiles and other forms of sexual abuse. We can talk about the Crusades, right? But
Yes.
that's not the same thing as the faith itself. So people really need to distinguish the idea of science from bad people who use science to do things. Cars are not innately bad, but if I use my car to run you over on purpose, my car has done a terrible thing, but I've used it to do that, right? It's not like the car did it. So pharmaceutical companies use science to make a ton of money. Yep, they sure do.
Hmm.
Is there a different way of using science so that money is less prominent and public health is more prominent? Sure, of course, right?
Yes.
It's not, it's the pharmaceutical company, it's not the science, right?
Hmm.
So from my perspective as an historian of science, that's what I would say. So the
Okay.
suspicion of science is, to me, it's misplaced. It, it's
Hmm.
it's it should be more a suspicion of what the science is being used to do, right?
Hmm.
So engineering, um, granola bars so that they have lots of protein, but doing that by infusing, some poor batch of oats with like crazy synthetic materials, or dyeing things with dyes that are carcinogens. Like the invention of the dye and the putting of the dye into the food are not the same thing as discovering how to make the dye, right?
Hmm.
So if I came up with red dye number 5 or whatever it is, I wouldn't necessarily be like, yes, we should put it in the in food, and I don't care if it makes people sick and maybe even die. Let's make money from it. Like, right? That's me. So, um, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is actually the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the regulation process. When the regulation process works, it works really well, right? When human beings do what they're supposed to do, when they say, "Where's your data?" When they insist on trials being run, when they insist on the full process being followed, regulation works great. The FDA works great. How do I know? Thalidomide is one super example. Unlike most other countries on the planet, when thalidomide got to the United States, Frances Oldham Kelsey said, I need data, and they didn't have any. And she said, I'm not approving this until I have data. And by the time they got finished yelling at her, there was plenty of data that said that actually thalidomide caused incredible damage to human beings, not just to
Hmm.
fetuses, but actually to adults who took it as well. So did it work? Yeah, regulation was great. Have we seen when the FDA approves things and it really shouldn't? You betcha, right? Let's take the
Hmm.
example of the dyes that I just used, right? Those dyes have just now, in the pre-January 20th FDA, been disapproved.
Just like
They've been,
red 40 or
yeah,
one,
exactly, right? Well,
whereas Europe kind of has been doing that for
way
a
ahead of
decade.
us.
Yeah.
Right? Why? Why is that? Is science magically different in in France? No, of course it's not. It's that the FDA, the human beings of the FDA had a different set of criteria, right?
Hmm.
They approved or didn't approve based on different things. They revisited their decision or they didn't, right?
Hmm.
Um, that's those are the people. So no, I don't like science being used to take advantage of me. And no, I hate those commercials that say things like, women, you smell, all of you smells. You should, use all body deodorant. It's like, no. It's just that's just insane, right? Like, well, to
Yes.
me, that's
Yeah.
teaching women that their bodies are evil and bad and that they need chemicals to make their bodies better. Well, actually,
Hmm.
the human body works incredibly well when left to its own devices. I mean, when it gives itself cancer and stuff like that, not so much. But,
Hmm.
no, women do not smell. Their elbows do not smell. Like the behind your ears, not a smelly spot. So tip of your nose, not so smelly. You can do smelling, but you do not actually emit odors from the tip of your nose as a general rule, right? But we see people using the science that creates deodorants and that sort of thing to
Hmm.
teach women these horrible, in my opinion, attitudes about themselves and the female body. And why do they do that? Because it makes money, right? That's
Yeah.
not good for humanity. Well, okay, it's that's that's crummy, but that's a use of science rather
Hmm.
than the idea that it's not true because you tell me it's true, no matter
Hmm.
how convincingly you say it.
Yes.
I don't care that you're on TikTok telling me that what I really need to do is drink a glass of cold water before I go to bed every night and my belly fat will magically melt away. I don't know you.
Yeah.
I don't know how you know that, right? But
Yeah.
somebody on TikTok saying, drink a glass of cold water every night before you go to bed and your belly fat will melt away is the equivalent of reading Galen in the 13th century and going, the body works like Galen says it does. Well, why should I
Yes.
believe Galen? Well, I mean, is there anything that corroborates that? Actually, not really. Okay, then. But
Hmm.
that's the strategy for those people. Science actually not a bad way of making sure that it's it does what it's supposed to do,
Yes.
and that it's okay for you.
Hmm. Um, so this was another one. You mentioned some of the things might be more complex with the men and women or apothecaries and women at home as healers. But do you see any parallels between the marginalization of women healers in the past and contemporary issues in healthcare, such as undervaluing nursing or midwifery?
Oh gosh, yes, yes,
Okay,
yes, absolutely.
that's not like that's not too simplified, like in
Oh
terms
no,
of
I don't think so at all. I don't think
okay.
so at all. And one of the reasons why I would say that is because it comes down to money over and over and over again, right?
Hmm.
So, um, devaluing women, at least in the West, hinges on plenty of misogynist ideas, right?
Hmm.
You don't need a woman to be a healer um, in, say, medieval Germany or what's now Germany, to say, she's terrible and evil, and you stay away from her, and what is it? Paul in Corinthians 1 says it's better to marry than to burn. Well, what a choice, right? So so sure. I mean, there's plenty of misogyny to go around before that. Women, the attacks on women healers really ramp up as it becomes more feasible to turn to professionals, right? To the trained professionals, as there are more of them, as there's more money shared, as there's a push to commodify medication, right? And so part of the campaign is to say the thing that you get at home is inferior to the thing that you get in the lab. That's actually another chapter in my book. And one of the ways that you do that is you say either, well, you say any version of women don't know what they're doing, right? It might
Hmm.
be mom means well. She really loves you, but she's going to kill you despite her best intentions. Or women are really those, green-skinned, warty, hook-nosed crones in the forest with their cauldrons who, lead Macbeth astray and will only give you foamy things that are really super bad for you. Why would you ever do that? Right. So there's that association. And the more that's to the economic advantage of people to discredit women, untrained women, but women as a category, then the more it's going to catch hold, right?
Hmm.
Um, so we certainly see historically that when it was economically convenient to let women take care of people, right? You can have all the
Hmm.
poor people because they're only going to pay you in things like eggs. Although today, of course, that would be like a fortune. But
Yeah.
you know, and I will take care of the people who can pay me in gold coins. There was that for a very long time, and that has turned into basically everybody should get their care from professionals, right? You shouldn't trust
Hmm.
mom at home. One of at the same time that the push to take over pharmaceuticals was going on, there was a push to take over midwifery. Um, so if you think about it from a physician's point of view, people are going to have babies forever, right? Like that's not likely to stop anytime soon. But if you do your job right, somebody's going to stop having the fever and they're going to get over those purple spots. So that fever and those purple spots are only going to make you money for so long. Ideally, if you
Hmm.
do your job, you're going to cure them. And you have to do your job because people won't keep coming to you, presumably.
Hmm.
If you don't, right? They'll go to some other doctor or they'll go to mom or wherever they'll go. But people are always having babies. Like that's not going to stop anytime soon.
Hmm.
So there was a real push to get involved in the birthing room by men
Hmm.
in the end of the 17th and into the 18th century. And it took a long time. I mean, that one was really tough because that ran into questions of the female body and modesty, right? Is
Hmm.
it okay for a strange man to be in a woman's bedroom while she is giving birth, right? Like that's a pretty intimate moment. There's female anatomy involved that normally a stranger is not supposed to see. Like, whoa.
Hmm.
So that was controversial in a different way.
Okay.
One of the things, again, you see this in the United States as opposed to, say, Europe, which is that in Europe, less intervention is more on the whole.
Mm.
The cesarean rate, for example, is far lower than it is in the United States. Prenatal care, postnatal care, um, parental leave, these are all things that are considered really, really important. And so you have countries that give lots of time off. There's lots of care for mother, for child. And those were priorities that we saw a lot in domestic medicine. So, in domestic medicine,
Hmm.
for example, when a woman gave birth, she was attended by the women of her family and her community. And then for the next month at least, she didn't do a thing. All she did was nurse the baby. The
Yes.
women of her family and community came and they took care of her, ideally, right? Like that was supposed to be what happened. And the idea was that she wasn't supposed to get up and walk around. Birth is an incredibly difficult ordeal. She needed to be taken care of. She needed to be able to nurse the baby. The baby needed to be able to nurse. Like these things were really super important. So there was a real value for that.
Hmm.
And that's an ethos, right? And you can see that in countries today. These things are really important. The health, the well-being, these things are really important. In the United
Hmm.
States, we have such an emphasis on intervention and machinery and technology that is only really in the early decades of changing. We also have very little interest in prenatal care or postnatal care. And that's why the maternal mortality rate is astronomical. We have a maternal mortality rate, especially when it comes to African American women, comparable to developing countries. That's outrageous. There's
Hmm.
no reason for that. And the first wards that get closed when hospitals run into economic difficulty is the maternity ward. They're expensive. They are sort of often lawsuits waiting to happen. And so, what if you're trying to save money? What do? Well, you get rid of the maternity ward, which means that in rural America, getting care, getting to a hospital in case of an emergency is very difficult, really difficult. So as the commercialization of medication took hold, again, when it's the money making element of medication that's
Hmm.
prioritized, um, you who pays the people who have health issues pay, or the people
Mm.
who just have health, good or bad, right? Um,
Yes.
when in fact the health part of the equation is prioritized, you have different health outcomes. And
Hmm.
it's like a sliding scale, right? It's a continuum. It's not all or nothing.
Hmm. Yes. And no, so I also had another question because there's a lot of interesting historical figures throughout the book, and you also mentioned when you were at the library just discovering some other archival discoveries.
Yeah.
But was there any particular archival discovery or historical figure that deeply resonated with you?
I For me, actually, one of the things that was most exciting in my research was solving 300-year-old, more than that, 400-year-old medical mystery, which is how did Lady Venetia Digby die? Now, admittedly, Lady Venetia Digby does not haunt the general public's dreams. The mysterious circumstances of her death do not necessarily bother people the way, say, Amelia Earhart's do.
Hmm.
Um, but Venetia Digby was a really important person, well known, very respected in her lifetime. And her death was very unexpected, according to sources. And the causes for it have been attributed to some pretty bonkers things. Right. So some historians said that she was poisoned by her husband. Um, some sources said that she was poisoned by her husband because he was trying to come up with a way of preserving her beauty. There's a Nathaniel Hawthorne short story, I think, Rappaccini's Daughter, that's like that. Some say that he poisoned her because he was jealous of all the other men who were looking at her. Venetia Digby was famously beautiful, like a world-renowned beauty, like famously beautiful.
Yes.
Some say that that he killed her because of jealousy. Some people, like there's a whole bunch of theories about how she died, generally having to do with Digby, her husband, deliberately or accidentally killing her. And so I went back and I looked. I looked at her life. I looked back at not reports of her health, because there really aren't any, but descriptions of her and descriptions of things that happened in the household. And I looked at the postmortem report and, or rather, what her husband recorded of the postmortem. And then I researched all the things that he had been giving her to see if they really, A, were they poisonous, and B, did he think they were poisonous?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer was, one, he gave her viper wine, which is not poisonous. We might consider it disgusting. It's made by putting a whole bunch of vipers into a cask of wine and then letting them drown and decompose. And then you drink the wine. Personally, ew. But at the time, everybody thought viper wine was really good for you. It was like having a glass of orange juice every day or something like that. Like it was considered a health tonic. So that he was giving her viper wine wasn't his effort to kill her at all. It was his effort to preserve her health. So then the question is, well, what was viper wine supposed to do? So I researched that, and that gave me a sense of what was wrong with her. And then I could put why she would be taking viper wine, and I combined that with what the postmortem revealed.
Mm-hmm.
And what I discovered was she had had a stroke. That wasn't what killed her. The stroke had to have happened before, and that the Viper wine was to help her with the debilitating effects of the stroke.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens sometimes with stroke survivors is that the the dead cells can cause the cells around them, the dead brain cells can cause the cells around them to die, and that
Mm-hmm.
essentially liquefies the brain. And so when Venetia Digby's autopsy revealed that her brain was basically mush, then I knew, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Venetia Digby had had a stroke at some point earlier, possibly several months earlier, when she had given birth to her last child, George, and she'd had a really rough life. She'd had a very difficult set of pregnancies. She'd had a lot of pregnancies in a short period of time, and it's quite possible she had a stroke during labor
Mm-hmm.
and delivery, but she'd had a stroke somewhere, and the Viper wine was to help her with the symptoms. And eventually she died because too much of her brain liquefied. And when I discovered that, I was really excited. Like, wow,
Yes.
Venetia Digby died in 1633, and here I was in 2024, and I had solved the mystery, and I was so excited. But I had done it by going back and looking at the recipe, and looking what it was used for, at doing sort of not like medical forensics on Venetia Digby, although that was part of it, but doing like a
Mm.
pharmaceutical forensics. And man, that was really exciting and so much fun. So that was, I think that really stands out for me as one of the
Wow.
cool moments. I was so excited that I emailed my agent and I said, I figured out why Venetia Digby died. And then I explained why that was so amazing, because I figured that maybe she didn't care that much about why Venetia Digby died, but I think it's really, really cool. So it was a
No,
big moment for me.
that's fascinating. And then lastly, with your book, some people don't like saying what they would hope the readers might take away from the book, but what might you hope readers take away from the Apothecaries way?
Well, there are a bunch of things, but I think the biggest thing, and I say this at the end especially, is that we live now in a time when medication is a thing that you buy and sell. It's a commodity,
Hmm.
like shoes, cars, hats, pork bellies. I don't think actually people buy and sell futures and pork bellies anymore, but they used to. Um, Things like that, right? And
Yeah.
um, and there was a time when we didn't do that. So the fact that we live in a system now where that's what we do is not inevitable, and it's also not natural. It's not
Mm.
like gravity, right? So if we don't like it, because human beings created the system in which that happens, we can decide to do something about it. Now, should we do something about it? Should we not do something about it? Other countries have adjusted the system in ways that work with their values and principles. In the United States, I would argue that we're tinkering, but we're not really addressing the system per se.
Hmm.
Um, so I think people just need to think about the fact that it doesn't have to be this way. It was made this way. And so if we don't like it, we can do something about it. And
Yes.
that's what I really hope people take away with it. It's not inevitable. It's not natural that we pay for
Hmm.
medication. We do because we made it that way.
It's just become part of what we're used to, but it doesn't,
Yeah.
like you said, we can change.
Hmm.
And then I had, just because our library's located on the North Fork,
Yeah.
um, I was curious, possibly when was the first time you came out to the North Fork, and what did you think of the area when you initially came out?
I came out to the north. My first memory of being out on the North Fork, so it's possible I was here earlier and don't remember. But my first memory of coming out to the North Fork was, I think, 1996 or 1997. And my parents had just told us that they wanted to move to the North Fork, me and my brother. And we were really surprised. And so we came out with them. They brought us out. I mean, my brother and I were adults. We had graduated from college. We were out in the world, like doing our things. And they brought us out and they said, "You're really going to like it." And we loved it. And I'll speak for me. I saw immediately why they wanted to move to the North Fork. It's beautiful, first of all. I mean,
Hmm.
wow. And there's so much nature left. From my perspective, there's so much history. It's living history, right? Like there are families that have been on the North Fork on Long Island 300, 400 years, right? They
Yes.
came with the first English settlers. Now the Dutch were here first, but
Hmm.
but there are families that came with the first English settlers. You can walk around the cemetery in Mattatuck, the one that's right across from Love Lane, and there are
Yes.
people buried there from the 17th century. There are families that were wiped out in presumably smallpox
Mhm.
epidemics where they're buried. The headstones read like one right after the other, one day, the next day, the next day, the next day. Like it, you can see the life that was here, but because
Mhm.
so much of it is preserved, the water, the trees, the birds, it's really beautiful. And I remember coming out the first time I saw, this will sound silly, I guess, but the first time I saw Peconic daisies. I mean, I love Peconic daisies, and I had never seen them before. And there was just this beautiful bank of them in the backyard of the house my parents eventually moved into. And I just thought that's the most beautiful thing. And I mean, I've been to some beautiful places. I'm fortunate enough to have been to some amazing places, but I just really love it. There's something about the air and the water and the sky on the North Fork that is just amazing.
Mhm. Yes.
And then there are places like Floyd Memorial Library, which have been there for forever and are obviously loved and used. Like I just think that's beautiful.
Yes. And obviously you've come out and seen it over the years, and
Yeah.
obviously things change, but I think the
Mhm.
North Fork has been able to preserve a lot of its land and
Yeah.
history. What would you hope for the future of the North Fork down the line?
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope that there is a strong energy for preserving,
Hmm.
right? Fresh and salt water, the shores, the woods, the land. I think there is so much that is valuable about it, in terms of human existence, in terms of tourism, everything.
Hmm.
I think that is a tremendous asset.
Hmm.
How beautiful it is and how much of it is still here, that I really hope for the future that that is recognized as the tremendous value, morally, ethically, economically, that it is.
Hmm.
So that's one thing. I also think of the North Fork as a place of terrific creative energy and innovation. And I think of the wineries. I mean, the first person to think that would be a great place to grow grapes, right? Like, wow.
Yes.
And then the adoption of wind power and the farm stands. And I was just there recently, and Palmanock has just put out three kinds of non-alcoholic wine.
Hmm.
And I just like, I really think of the North Fork as a place with this terrific, dynamic force. And
Yeah.
I hope that the factors that go into maintaining that, the welcoming of people, right? Like there are immigrants on the North Fork that I think make the culture really rich and fabulous, but
Hmm.
they contribute to what's there. They make it. I mean, what's happened in Riverhead, for example, I think is just absolutely splendid. There's this sort of marvelous, quiet, slow, but genuine efflorescence going on, I think, there.
Yeah.
So I hope the things that preserve that glorious, creative energy, especially as it works with the place, right? That it doesn't try to
Hmm.
change the North Fork, but that it says, what's great about the North Fork? What can we do with this place to keep it as it is and to make it exciting and wonderful and to sustain who we are? I love that about the North Fork, and I
Hmm.
really hope that that is preserved as well. I think those
Yes,
two things go together.
definitely. No, and then lastly, I just ask if there was anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't talked about yet or didn't cover.
No, you've allowed me to roam far and wide, which I really, really appreciate. And your questions have been splendid. I really have enjoyed it so much. I could not possibly add. It's been terrific. So thank you
Oh,
very much.
absolutely. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast and really share a lot of information about your fascinating book. I would definitely recommend people check it out.
Oh, thanks very much. And they can get it at the library. They can get it at Floyd
Yes,
Memorial Library.
we
And
have a
I
copy
recommend that people check out the library. So
there. Yes. Well, thank you so much again for coming
thank
on.
you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 111 with Karen Bloom Gevirtz. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.